Have we watched the
Karen
movie Out
Blixen
of Africa?
Museum.
No, have you seen it?
You know, I tried to watch it, but I didn't get to get around to it.
In the book?
The book either.
Oh.
I got to catch up.
So maybe after this tour, I should actually reconsider.
Yeah.
So kindly take your seat.
Okay.
These ones should just... No, these ones are enough.
Okay.
And maybe there's... Yeah. So welcome once more to the home of the famous Danish baroness called Karen. She was born in Denmark in the year 1885. She was a second child in a family of 5 children. From the time she was 8 years old up until when she was 10 years old, she used to write some short stories. She could also make some pencil drawings, and that was actually an illustration that she loved artwork. And so because of that, her family decided to enroll her at the Royal Academy in Copenhagen to pursue her artwork. From there, she went to France and Italy to further her studies. Okay? Now, when she was 28 years old, she actually accepted a marriage proposal from her Swedish half-cousin by the name Baron Blixen. Okay? Now, these two were restless in their country, and so their mutual uncle called Count Morgan Frigis advised them to go into the British East Africa, as it was called then, considering that was actually a colonial period and this was a British protectorate. It was a British colony. So that is where the name British East Africa came from. So the mutual uncle advised them to come into this region and find a future for themselves. Okay? So in the end, and this is simply because their mutual uncle had just arrived back to his country from a hunting safari here in Kenya, and he'd got very enthusiastic tales to tell about this particular place. So that is why he chose this place of all the other places. So in the year 1913, Baron moved into this place, and later on in the year 1914, he was actually joined by Karen. So the following day after Karen's arrival, they actually had their marriage, the ceremony that is, which was held in Mombasa. We know where Mombasa is?
Yeah.
It's a town found at the coast of Kenya. From there, they went for a honeymoon, which was held at the shores of Lake Naivasha. Lake Naivasha? That's in the Rift Valley, and you'll get to see a lot of pink flamingos. Please enjoy the tour once you're there. So when they came back from the honeymoon, they settled at their very first house, which was called the Mbagadi house. Okay. Now we realize that when Karen and Baron were coming into Africa, they had an intention of doing dairy farming. But the moment they arrived here, their friends advised them not to do dairy farming, but instead do coffee farming, because it could have actually made them millionaires. So they were so in love with the idea of becoming millionaires. So they fell for that idea. So they started doing the coffee farming on a 700-acre piece of land, which had been bought jointly by their two families. That was Karen's family together with Baron's family. But then later on, they sold the 700-acre piece of land and bought a 4,500-acre piece of land on which they only used 600 acres to cultivate coffee. Okay? 200 acres was used for maize and 100 acres was used for beans. The rest of the land was left as a natural forest. Okay? Now we realize that in the year 1917, again, they decided to buy another piece of land. So they bought an adjacent 1,500-acre piece of land with a fully furnished farmhouse called the Bogani House. And that's actually where we are today, currently, the Karen Blixen Museum. So they moved from their first house, which was called the Mbagadi House, into their second house, which was known as the Bogani House. And this is where they lived for the better part of the time they were in Africa. Okay? Now, in as much as they wanted to do coffee farming, this was supposed to be a common idea. It was a common goal. they were both expected to take part in the coffee farming. But unfortunately, after starting the coffee farming, Baron lost interest. Remember, Baron was Karen's husband, so he lost interest. Instead, he spent a lot of his time in the bushes. He was constantly on hunting safaris. Okay? So Karen was left all by herself, and she was now forced to manage the coffee farm alone. Remember, in the farm, she had a total of 1,000 workers, which was such a huge number of people to be managed by one person. But she didn't have a choice, so she did the managing of the coffee farming. Now, again, being that Baron spent a lot of his time in the bushes hunting, there was that loneliness that came with it. So Karen suffered from, a bit of loneliness and boredom. So because of this, she also decided to be visiting the other part of Nairobi town just to distract herself. She loved going to the Muthaiga Golf Club. And this club was actually very famous and popular amongst the white settlers who were here during that period of time. So in the year 1918, she actually went visiting to the Muthaiga Golf Club. Then she was able to meet an English businessman by the name Dennis Finch Hatton. The two became friends, and gradually they ended up becoming lovers. Now we realize that Karen's marriage faced quite a number of challenges that unfortunately led to their separation. They got separated, and then the official divorce now came in the year 1925. So after the divorce, Baron, who was Karen's husband, was forced to move out of this house. And it is now Dennis Finch Hatton, who was the lover, who now came into the house. But then again, just as Baron, Dennis also loved hunting so much. And luckily enough for him, he was a licensed pilot. He had a plane which was called the Gypsy Moth biplane. So whenever he wanted to go hunting, he could go to very far destinations, unlike Baron, who didn't have any plane. Okay? So in the year 1931, he had actually gone hunting in Voi. Voi is also a town found at the coast of Kenya. So he went there with one of his male servants, who was called Kamau. Unfortunately, when these two were coming back, the plane developed some mechanical issues and they ended up having a plane crash. So after the plane crash, his remains were actually given to Karen, who later on interred them at the foot of the Ngong Hills, as it was in his wish. And this is because when he was still alive, Dennis that is, they loved going to the Ngong Hills. They used to go there either horse riding or even hiking, and he fell in love with a particular spot. So he always told Karen, whenever I die, this is where I would wish to be buried. So that had to be honored. So if you're to go to the Ngong Hills today, you'll actually be able to see Dennis Finch Hatton's grave. Okay? Now, in as much as they did coffee farming, there were also quite a number of challenges that they experienced in the farm. Number one, talk of the soil. It was too acidic, so it could not support the growth of coffee plants. The other challenge was this region received inadequate rainfall. Now we realize that coffee is a highland type of a crop. These are crops that do well in highland areas where we have a cool and wet climate. And that cool and wet climate is usually characterized by enough supply of rainfall. So due to the inadequacy in rainfall around this region, the coffee plants could not do well. And then also there came a time when they were expecting a very huge harvest. But unfortunately, the farm got infested by locusts, which ended up eating all the coffee beans that were almost ready for harvesting. And now in the year 1923, her coffee factory burnt down in a fire incident. The incident was actually accidental. It was not intentional. It was caused by the Maasais, who were Karen's immediate neighbors. Now, these Maasais are known to be pastoralists. Okay? These are a community of people that usually keep very huge herds of cattle, and they always move from one location to the other in search of water and pasture to their cattle. Now, what separated them from Karen's land was a river which was called the Magadi River. And the river was also a seasonal river. So at times it would actually dry up. Now, these Maasais had a belief that whenever you burn the grass, the soil's fertility could increase. And because of the increased soil's fertility, new grass could grow which could now serve as pasture to their cattle. So this time around, when they were burning the grass, unfortunately, River Mbagathi had actually gone dry. So the fire spread past the river, caught up with the factory, which went down into flames. Now, please note, before the fire incident, it is Karen's family back in Denmark who used to send her money to manage the coffee farm. But after this incident, the family became so reluctant because already there were quite a number of challenges that she was facing in the farm, and now the factory had burnt down. So they stopped supporting her. They stopped sending her money. So the moment they cut off the financial support, she did not have any other stable source of income. And so she went bankrupt. Remember, this actually came at a time when she got so many debts she needed to pay, but she didn't have the means of doing that. She could no longer even pay her workers in the farm. So she now thought it would be wise enough if she sells most of her property so as to get money, pay off all her debts, and then leave this place. So she ended up selling her house, which is this house, to a real estate agent by the name the Richardsons and Martins Company Limited. Part of her furniture got auctioned in South Africa, and part of it was actually taken by her friend called Lady Macmillan. At that particular time, Lady Macmillan was actually constructing a library in Nairobi town. It is called the Lady Macmillan's Library, and this library was in remembrance of her late husband. Okay, so when she realized that her very good friend Karen had gone bankrupt, she decided to come in, help her by buying off her furniture and in exchange giving her money so that she could settle all her debts. Yeah. So whatever went to Lady Macmillan's library was actually So now right over here, this is where we have the coffee machine. It was known as the Gordon's Gordiola coffee machine. Now, once the beans were ready for harvesting, that's after they had turned red or deep brown, they'd be harvested. Then the very first process was sorting, and the coffee beans had to be sorted so as to separate the good beans from the bad coffee beans. After that sorting was done, the good coffee beans could now be placed in this machine. This is actually known as the pulping machine, and the beans were placed here so as to separate the husks from the beans themselves. Once the separation had been done, the coffee beans could now be collected from down over here, and then they got fermented for 24 hours. And the fermentation was necessary so as to reduce the excessive sugars in the coffee beans. So of course, with the fermentation, the coffee beans just got soaked into water and they stayed there for 24 hours. So once they had been fermented, the coffee beans could now be loaded into the steam drying machine. Okay. Now right over here, we do have a boiler which is separated in, it has two chambers, that is the lower chamber and the upper chamber. Now it was in the lower chamber where fire was lit with the help of firewood, and in the upper chamber we had water. Now when the fire was lighting in the lower chamber, the water in the upper chamber could get heated, and when the water got heated, of course there was that production of steam. So that steam could be collected in this chamber now. And then right over here we've got an engine. This engine was ignited by the help of the Fordson tractor that was at the front part of the house. So when the engine was on, the turbine over here could then release a lot of pressure. So that pressure could then compress the steam from this chamber into the steam drying chamber over there. So they got steam dried for 24 hours. But then again we realized even after the 24 hours, the coffee beans were not dry enough. Then they could be removed from that because there was still some moisture in the coffee beans. So they could be removed from the steam drying machine and be placed outside here where they got sun dried for 21 days. So only then were the coffee beans dry enough. Then they could get packed into sacks, then be loaded onto the wagons, ready for transportation. Okay? So they were transported to Nairobi railway station with the help of the wagons. From Nairobi railway station, they were transported to the port of Mombasa via railway.